My tech stack is something that's very important to me. If you've been around for a while, you probably remember the early days. This whole channel started around the T3 stack. Before T3 was even me, it was my stack. I did have the domain t3.gg way before any of that was even thought of, before Tailwind was even created, because T3 stands for me. It's 3 letters after the T. But a lot of things have changed since I put out the original T3 stack. I've looked at a ton of different solutions and changed a bunch of stuff in my stack, but also went back to a handful of the things I loved back then. I haven't done a proper update on what my stack looks like since back at the start of 2023. I did actually film a video about this last year, but it kept getting pushed back on the calendar until it got so out of date that I feel bad putting it out now. So instead, I'm going to break down what I'm using now, and more importantly, why I wouldn't recommend a handful of the things I am using to anyone who doesn't want to go insane in the process of building. My stack's a little chaotic now, but more than ever, I think there's a lot we can learn from it in order to build good, production-ready, type-safe TypeScript applications. But I need to pay some bills in order to keep these things maintained, so let's hear a quick word from today's sponsor before we dive in. My teams are shipping more pull requests than they ever have before, probably because of all these nice AI tools. That said, it also means they're waiting on CI more than ever, and I'm tired of it. What if I told you there was a way to make your CI 2 times faster with just one line of code changed? I would sound insane, which I understand, but hear me out because Blacksmith is killing it. It's literally one line change in your action runner, and now you're getting way faster builds and a way better price. There's tons of companies already using Blacksmith for their production builds, including companies like Clerk, and they've done crazy stuff to make their builds so fast. One of the fun hacks is using gaming CPUs, like in gaming computers, because they have much higher single thread performance, which is super handy when you're trying to do a big build with lots of single threaded work. They also have much faster caching because they locate their cache directly next to the CI boxes, which is silly that GitHub doesn't do it, but it helps them a ton. Also helps that they give you 25 gigs of cache instead of the usual 10 gigs you get from GitHub. Oh, and if you're curious how fast that speed improvement is, it's from 100 megabits per second to over 400. They've already built runners for pretty much every language you could want. Go, Rails, Rust, Python, JavaScript, whatever. You're almost certainly covered. Oh, and by the way, 3,000 free minutes a month. You don't even need to add a credit card. It couldn't be easier to sign up and give a go. Thank you, Blacksmith, for sponsoring today's video. Check them out today at soydev.link/blacksmith. I have the 2 applications up here that are the ones I've made decisions about the most recently. And there's a lot of overlap between the two, but also a lot of differences. And the one that is older has a stack I'm happier with, but also doesn't solve some specific problems that the stack for the other solves. So these are PickThing and T3 Chat. If we go through and break this down the traditional way, there's a handful of categories that most of us care about. There's front end, framework, style, system, state, manager, API, system, library, backend, framework, backend language, database, what do I want to call the dialect, I guess. Database dialect, database provider, hosting provider, etc. There's a lot of these categories. And if you've been around long enough, you can guess for most of these what I'm doing. React, Tailwind, ShadCN. State management's a more complex thing. API system library, also more complex thing. Backend framework, Next, usually. Backend language, TypeScript, database dialect. We'll get there. Database provider, we'll very much get there. And hosting provider, Vercel, Cloudflare, Netlify. So this is the quick summary, but the details are about to get a hell of a lot more chaotic. I also missed pieces in here like router. I'm sure we'll find others as I go. Auth is a really good one. Thank you, chat. Package manager. There are a lot of pieces to a modern front-end stack, and copy-pasting the ones I pick is not going to be the right solution. And there's a handful of things you might not need at all. Like you might be building something that doesn't need an auth provider. You might be building something that the database is just your auth provider. You might be building something where you don't need a state manager. You can just do it in vanilla React or with server components. There's a lot of different things you may or may not need throughout all of this, which is why my community originally built Create T3 app, because people wanted me to put up a template of all of the things I like to use and how I use them. But if I did that, you'd be installing things you don't need in tools that you aren't using. So I suggested that someday, if I had the time, I would build a CLI to scaffold out a Next.js app the way I would recommend, and then just didn't. But then Nexel for my community did, and then CJ and Julius stepped up to help maintain it. I've contributed 0 code to this project, but it is awesome. And it still is how I start most of my Next.js applications when I'm not doing like a quick demo of a Next feature. Create T3 app has you pick each of the parts when you set it up. So if I make a new project, sandbox, npm create T3 app at latest, and you do this, you give it a name, some demo. You pick between TypeScript and JavaScript, and only one of the answers is actually valid. You say yes or no for Tailwind. You say yes or no for TRPC, which is a very important piece we'll get to in a bit. You say yes or no for NextAuth. There's still a future where we add other options here, because NextAuth is in a weird state. Then for the database ORM, your options are none, Prisma or Drizzle. You can use App Router if you want. I would highly recommend it nowadays. And then you pick which SQL dialect you want. Hopefully by now, you're starting to get the idea. It does all of this stuff for you. But it's still the modular pieces. We're not forcing all of them on you. We're giving you options, and you can swap out one option for another if you would like, which I think is the whole point of the stack. That's why I built it. Simplicity, modularity, and full stack type safety. I didn't make the template here, but I did make up the stack, and I did really push for this modularity at a point where, as an industry, we were starting to go in this way, but the mind share was still leaning towards the Rails way of building things, where everything was provided as one solution that was part of the framework. I wanted to have the best solution for my different problems and the ability to throw away the parts I don't want. And this stack helped me get there in ways I didn't realize were possible at the time, and it's surprisingly close to the stack that I ship nowadays, as you'll see as we go through the parts. So let's do that. Let's go through those parts. I'm going to start with pick thing, because at the very least, the core app part is relatively similar to what people probably should use. I'm very happy with the stack here overall. And I've even had Ben Davis, my channel manager and also fellow YouTuber, who's more a Svelte guy, helping with this code base. And he's had such a good time with the way this project is set up that he's trying to copy parts of it into the Svelte ecosystem. He's having a hell of a time doing it. So you could just look at my dependencies here and get a lot of information about what we're doing. You'll probably get most of what you need from seeing that. But the way we use these things is interesting enough that I hope you stick through as we do it all. The probably best starting point is right at the top here, the front-end framework. It is very rare I build something nowadays that isn't using React. I say, even though I just shipped one of my biggest non-React projects ever. Needless to say, a project like, where is it here? Unduck probably isn't the best representation of how I like to build, because this is meant to be very minimal. A package JSON, as you see, is loaded with dependencies. We have the whole Vite plugin PWA, which actually, by the way, is a dev dep. I just need to move it over. I'm lazy. I'm sure there's 5 PRs that do it. But there are 3 build plugins. Oh no. So complex. And if we look at the code, you'll see, oh wow, it's even more complex. It's basically vanilla TypeScript, and the HTML is written by this one inline function if you don't pass search params. There is no front-end library for this project. This is a very quickly thrown together HTML snippet in JavaScript that is a very specific thing. So when a project doesn't need a complex UI or all these cool tools and solutions, I'm more than happy to throw away all of them. So my reaching for React isn't because I think everything should be React or I'm too lazy to build my own UIs or whatever. It's because complex UIs benefit from a library for building complex UIs. And for better or worse, most of the UI I build nowadays is somewhat complex. So something like Unduck, which is very complex, as you could see, doesn't need a library. But something like PickThing, which is inherently significantly more complex, you'll see this benefits a lot from a library that lets us have more dynamic behaviors in the application. So let's talk about how we actually build those dynamic behaviors and all of the layers for it. Let's start at the root, the layout. The first thing you'll see in most of my apps that have auth is Clerk. I still find them to be the easiest way to add auth to a Next.js application and have all the niceties like the little button you can use for signing in, actual place to store user data, not having it clog up your whole database, not having a thing you have to deal with and maintain, not having to go set everything up with all the different auth providers you want to add. It's way easier to get started. And if the app does get far enough that I want to release it to the public, it's relatively easy for me to push over that hump. But there are times where Clerk doesn't make sense, which we'll get to in a bit, because I have not been using Clerk in some of my projects. And on one hand, it's been very nice. And on the other hand, it's been very painful. For the most part, Clerk's been really nice. And when I don't have it, I do very much miss it. I then have my analytics, which, what did I even use for analytics for this project? Oh, this is the Vercel analytics component. I don't remember putting that in. I have no idea how that ended up. Oh, Vercel analytics for now from me 6 months ago. That's how that got there. Getting owned by the Git T plugin once again. I normally have it uninstalled, and I will probably do that after this. Or Git Lens, whatever it's called. Yeah. But then we have the analytics that I actually care about, which is PostHog. Generally speaking, if you want to know how much I care about one of the projects I built, check if I have PostHog set up. If I have PostHog set up, I probably care about the project. If I don't have PostHog set up, I probably don't care about the project. PostHog is a phenomenal analytics provider that I've loved working with. I bullied them into sponsoring me as their first ever sponsored thing because I don't want to talk about other analytics providers. I don't like them much. I really like PostHog. So I use them for everything. This isn't an ad. They're not paying for this. They might ask to be an ad for the video, but I will reject because this is just my actual take. I've been using PostHog for years before they sponsored me, and I'll be using them for years after. I like them a lot. It's a really good way to do analytics for your product. Everything I care about is using PostHog. Things that I want basic numbers on and don't care at all about might use Plausible, but I've been moving more and more away from Plausible in favor of PostHog because I need data that is user specific. Plausible is very much anonymous, generic web tracking analytics, but it doesn't have product analytics, which is a different thing. I should do a whole video about this in the future, but web page view analytics are very different from product analytics. It's nice to know which pages people are going to, but it's much nicer to know how many image uploads a given user does. And those are entirely different products. The first is a Google Analytics thing, like the Google generic analytics product. PostHog is more like things like Mixpanel or Amplitude, where you can do the deep product analytics for the things users are actually doing. And if you want to know how many users have uploaded more than 50 images, that is not a thing you're ever going to get out of Google Analytics or Plausible. And more my applications are actually user specific, so I need more things for that. But also I have stuff like QuickPick, which is my service for quickly formatting images. And QuickPick, I think I have Plausible set up on it. I vaguely remember doing that. This is an in-browser app that I've barely maintained since launching it. That is a nice, quick way to solve a handful of image management problems that were pissing me off at the time. QuickPick is not a real service that I'm maintaining. It's a quick picture management tool that I built to solve some specific problems. PickThing's an actual production service that we shipped for managing your assets as a content creator. I still use QuickPick for a bunch of stuff, yes, for those who are asking. I love QuickPick. I use it all the time. But PickThing is crucial to how I run my business. Every single thumbnail I make that has me in it is using one of the assets from QuickPick. Anyways, from here we see the thing that I didn't have originally that I ended up adding later on, made my life much better, TRPC. I keep making the same mistake where I convince myself that my dynamic applications can get by with server components, and they cannot. I wish I didn't need TRPC all the time. I wish that the apps I was building were simple enough that I didn't need it, and sometimes they are. If I hop to MarkerThing, for example, which is another one of those projects I use a lot, MarkerThing is how I manage all of the markers for my streams, which is how I take my 8-hour stream and chop it into individual topics so that my team can start editing it without having to download the whole thing and chop it themselves. What makes MarkerThing fun is it doesn't have a database, and its actual data access layer is kind of hilariously simple. If we hop over to the code for this, and we go to a channel page, here's the code. I run it on the edge because at the time that mattered, this is pretty old. I had forced dynamic to make sure that the page was dynamic every time you'd go to it. Thankfully, most of these are solved with the new dynamic IO stuff. But where things would get fun is I could just mount this async component that would grab your auth information, would grab the Twitch credentials using that auth information, would grab the Twitch user ID, and then fire API calls in order to generate that page with all the right VODs. Super cool. And none of this requires a database at all. The entire product of MarkerThing has no database. I am just getting the data from Twitch using the credentials I got from Clerk. It's awesome. And it made this code base significantly simpler. And funny enough, I had built this project twice before, and I wanted something that I was more confident sharing with other people. So I sat down with Mark and we quickly rebuilt it. It took like a day and a half. We built something significantly more maintainable and significantly less painful. And we did that by throwing away all the parts we didn't need. It's still kind of crazy that a service I use every day, that it's relatively data heavy, grabbing all the things that I need for all my videos, that this service has no database is something I find really genuinely cool. I love what we built with this tool. And I love how the React patterns have worked for it. But you can also see how old it is here. Fuck, this is a 2-year-old code base. God, that hurts. I'm getting old so fast. When server components first happened, JSX didn't support asynchronous function calls, so you had to put a TS-expect error before calling an asynchronous component. That's how you know how old this code base is, which is adorable. Painful, but adorable. Yeah. So this was all in on server components. We got a lot of benefit from it. Like, the behaviors here aren't dynamic. Once the stream is done, the stream is done. This content is static at that point. So you don't need a lot of back and forth between the client and the server. So not having good ways to go back up to the server didn't really cost me anything. This is actually one of the simplest code bases I have. And if you don't believe me, it's open source. You can go take a look. I love this project. I think it's a great example of keeping things simple when you can and taking advantage of a service like Clerk to not have to put a whole bunch of work into parts that you shouldn't have to. My previous attempts to do this involved rolling my own auth, handling Twitch OAuth myself properly, storing all of this stuff in database and managing all of it between. The new version is comically simpler. The whole thing is 1,200 lines of code. And most of that is like just reformatting data from the Twitch API and a giant pile of types for said data from the Twitch API. I loved that. So keep things simple when you can. If we were to like diagram out my stacks by complexity, the simplest is unduck, because unduck has no dependencies. It's as simple as can be. Then marker thing, much more complex, but not actually complex. It's more complex than unduck, so we have to handle auth and things. But I managed to trim down the layers there to make something way more maintainable. And I didn't get there, by the way, by thinking it through and just magically coming up with the simplest solution. I had to write it more complex 3 times and just trim the fat until I had something simple and maintainable. Then we have pick thing, which, funny enough, I went through the same thing with. I rewrote pick thing probably 4 times just because I built it to use, had a problem with it, looked at the code base, was like, I don't want to touch this, and just rewrote it and did that a few times. And then the version that we shipped is our production version. It's comically better for reasons that I'm not going to share too much of, because that's valuable enough information. It's niche enough and valuable enough. I'm not giving it away. But then we have something like T3 chat, significantly more complex. Like, there's a big complexity gap here simply because marker thing isn't interactive and unduck has no server at all. So there's a slight gap between marker thing and unduck, then a big gap because pick thing is now an interactive service with actual like user information and data that I have to manage properly, permissions, payment systems, so many other things. Then T3 chat, arguably pretty big gap here because now I have to do things very performantly, shifting data between tons of different APIs and services and mangling it all on the client. But then there's another gap before upload thing. Upload thing is not a code base I am comfortable enough with right now to confidently share how it works, because Julius and Mark have fully taken it over, because it has to be more complex. And I would not be good at my job if I understood how upload thing worked fully at this point, I'll be real. So yeah, we've covered the simplicity of unduck and marker thing at this point, I would say reasonably well. Let's go back to pick thing, because I think it has a lot of interesting stuff we can learn from. We go to dashboard, app, page. Here is the page you get if you're going to /app. And /app is the page on pick thing that has your information, the things that you've uploaded. So if you're not signed in, then I redirect you to /login. I then grab the subscription from database. If you're not subscribed, then I return the checkout component instead. But if you are signed in and subbed, you just go straight to image page. And here I originally did a server component. I have since changed my ways. It's now a client component. I get the data from React Query, from TRPC using React Query. We'll see a big change to how this works when we go more through the T3 chat code base. This call might be weird because I'm making a use query call, but I'm not putting something on the other side. This is me prefetching so that I don't have to fetch this stuff later and have another pop in. So by doing this here, I am able to skip multiple steps and fire a lot of data fetching with a single batch, which is really nice. Then if you don't have any images, I give you the little info, drag and drop images onto the page to get started. Otherwise, you get the actual content. You go to grouped image grid, takes in the images, grabs the tag params, and it renders the image groups. Nothing too complex here. The closest thing to complexity in this code base at this point is probably the database and the Stripe integrations in particular. If I was to really go back to this code base and make it more maintainable, the first thing I would do is gut the Stripe implementation and subscriptions, because we were confident that modeling that data properly was still the right thing to do, and I've since learned the error in those ways. That project was when I realized I wanted a better way to do Stripe, and then T3 chat was when I finally raged and did it. If you're adding payments to your app, please read this. I have been through so much hell with Stripe, and almost everyone I've talked to that thinks that their Stripe solution is working and good, once I forced them to sit down and read this, their conclusion was, oh, yeah, I missed a lot of things. At this point, I still recommend Stripe over alternatives. None of them are far along enough that I'm confident in them, but doing Stripe right isn't easy. The core piece that I recommend is syncing Stripe's data to a KV of some form, not to a relational database. Fuck adding that level of complexity to your main DB. Just throw it in a stupid key value store and use that as the thing that you check a user's status with. Makes life significantly easier maintaining complex payment systems. Highly recommend copying this. I wish I did for this code base. But the rest is pretty simple. You might notice something interesting here. SQLite. This project was originally on the free tier of PlanetScale. If you've been around for long enough, you might remember back in the day, PlanetScale had a pretty generous free tier where you'd get their $30 a month tier for free for one database. They changed that because the free tier was costing them a ton of money and the people who were using it were just support problems. They weren't actually meaningfully benefiting them. And they wanted to focus more on databases that cost $6,000 a month, not ones that cost $20 a month. So they killed the free tier. It had been scaling up to be used by massive companies like Intercom, like Square for Cash App, Block for Cash App, and really big scalable ones like T3 chat. We'll get to that all in a bit. But I had a handful of these smaller services that were using PlanetScale where I just couldn't justify the cost because they weren't making much money. So out of curiosity and willingness to try something else, I gave Terso a shot for this project. And I was initially quite impressed. And then I watched the chaos of Terso as it slowly unfolded. There's a reason I don't talk about Terso a whole lot, and I don't recommend them very often. It's one of those products I wanted to see succeed, and I am losing confidence in every day. They're a weird group, and we already see people in chat bringing it up. My data got deleted. I have watched some of the most embarrassing outages of my career from Terso. In case you're not familiar, Terso Tech, their main concept was a distributed SQLite database for whatever you want to build. And they have gotten lost multiple times throughout the process. They focused way too hard on Edge and moved away from it. The thing they do really cool is pricing. It's super cheap to get started. It's relatively cheap to keep using. $5 a month for 1,000 databases is really cool. Problem is, you don't know if the database is going to be there tomorrow or if you'll even get the right database back. There was an incident a while back where a person was trying to query data from their Terso database and nothing came back and they were confused. So they went and opened up the inspector and they had access to somebody else's database that had credit card numbers in it. Because the way Terso's infra worked at the time was if you're on the free tier, there wasn't compute being left up. Instead, they would store your database in S3 and pull it back up when the request was made. And they had an error in their code where they would pull up somebody else's S3 backup instead of yours sometimes, which is one of the most horrifying things I've ever heard about a database ever. Yeah. And recently they started moving over to AWS. I believe they were on Fly.io at the time. They're starting to move to AWS, and they accidentally wiped all AWS users' databases recently. So if you want your database to actually keep your data, be cautious. I hate talking about these things. I hate dunking on the Terso guys, but they've been weird enough to interact with that my confidence on this product is relatively low. Great quote from chat. Is Terso another example of don't gamble on the database? Yes. I gambled on it, and I'm lucky I haven't had the massive issues I've seen others having yet. Keyword yet. But I'm not fucking risking it at this point. I'm not taking the chance. So when I first started T3 chat, I went a very different path. T3 chat started entirely with Redis. The only database for T3 chat for a while was Redis. And that was actually really nice until people started storing hundreds of megabytes of data for their crazy threads. And then we end up with the divergence that exists between PickThing and T3 chat, which is T3 chat started with KV using Redis on Upstash specifically, which was actually awesome. Upstash was super nice to work with, super cheap, scaled great. The amount of storage per user was getting to a point that was untenable. So we moved over to Planet Scale, and it's been super smooth sailing since. When a service gets to the point where I need the benefits of the scale and functionality that Planet Scale provides, I make the move then. I've been very happy with Planet Scale for all of the production services that we run that have crazy throughput. Things like Upload Thing, and more importantly, things now like T3 Chat, both benefit greatly from the crazy performance characteristics and scalability of Planet Scale. Super reliable, super good, super happy. I don't want to call out other solutions. I will say that I have played with almost all of them, and I am happy with almost none of them. The two that currently sponsor my videos are actually within the better options. The Prisma Postgres product is probably the way I would recommend doing Postgres right now. I haven't deployed it yet, but everything I've seen in the demos I've played with from it is really good. And Prisma knows databases. So if you really want Postgres, like really want Postgres, probably the direction I would go for it personally. But I personally just don't use Postgres nowadays, almost ever. The other option that sponsors, and honestly, I have regret not using Convex more. These guys are killing it. I put together some demos of like parts of T3 Chat using Convex instead. There are quirks and gotchas because the big thing with Convex is they run your compute. Your APIs don't run on your infra anymore. They run on theirs. But by owning that, they allow for really cool characteristics with your queries and mutations where everything that could possibly update your database exists in their layer. So if somebody mutates something that somebody else has queried for, it can live update, which is super, super cool. I've been really impressed with Convex, and if they can figure out their local sync and caching story a bit further, I would see a future where we actually move T3 Chat to Convex. Enough parts are missing for that chaotic local layer that I just deal with the sync layer I built myself still, but Convex is like the thing that I look at and yearn for the most. And I will once again emphasize from chat that a lot of things have come up that I don't recommend. I don't want to spend a lot of time dunking on other solutions, but if you're watching this video, you're probably thinking, but what about X? I've thought about X. I've probably even shipped something with X, and I did not like it. So take that as you will. I could be wrong, but I've been very sad to see the terrible scaling characteristics, weird performance characteristics, and overall unreliable experience of pretty much every other database people are mentioning in chat, including ones I've been sponsored by. You might have noticed a theme starting to form here. Hopefully this will help emphasize the core of how I think about my stack. Step 1, start with the simplest reasonable thing. Step 2, add complexity as it's necessary. And step 3, regularly reflect on that complexity to see if it's actually necessary. Be very willing to delete and circumvent complexity where it is possible. To go back to like the marker thing example, I was convinced that I had to store a lot of data in DB for that product to work. And as I thought about it more and more and kept dealing with edge cases, I realized, oh, I'm effectively just transforming the shape of data that already exists in the Twitch API. Can I just use that? The answer was yes, and it makes things a lot simpler. So that's what I've been doing with everything I can. Generally speaking, complexity is the enemy of success and scale and all these other things. The only thing that actually scales is simplicity, so I always strive for it. And you'll notice in my stuff that I often find sometimes crazy hacks in order to maintain simplicity to the best of my ability. I also can't help but call this out. I saw people mentioning Google Sheets as a database as a way of keeping it simple. It is fucking not. Believe me, I want to use Google Sheets as a database so often. I genuinely, desperately want to. Good luck getting that off. The problem with Google Sheets as a database is it doesn't scale. It's Google Sheets. Google Sheets scales really well. Good luck connecting to it via their API. The API for Google Sheets is such trash. It's such a dumpster fire. It feels like it was written in the 90s. I don't know how anyone does anything with the Sheets API. Just getting approved through Google's fucking cloud stuff to be able to authenticate a user to access Google Sheets in the first place, or to hard code one sheet you've set up on your side. I actually want to use Google Sheets as a database, genuinely. It is effectively impossible. Funny enough, I was actually working on a project with Will Osman recently because he wants to build a hiring board. And I wanted a simple database that he would be able to edit without having to build all the UI and stuff for it. So I started with Google Sheets. 2 hours into trying to get it to auth, my roommate and CTO, Mark, comes over and laughs at me and says, I warned you, Theo, don't do this. So I caved and moved to Notion, which has actually been really nice. The Notion API is totally fine. So yeah, Google Sheets isn't the simple option. And that's not because Google Sheets isn't simple. That's because the API layer to actually do anything with it is one of the most unnecessarily complex piles of shit I've ever tried wading through in the last, at the very least, last 5+ years. Don't use Google Sheets as a database. Not because it's terrible to use a spreadsheet product as a database, but because the API to access that one is particularly trash. It is not the simple solution. And I wish it was. I do genuinely wish it was. It's just not viable. Anyways, start with the simple thing, add complexity as it is necessary, and regularly reflect to see if that complexity was necessary in the first place. Constantly take the opportunity to reflect on the problems you're having, the edges you're running into, and if you find enough bugs in a given thing that you produced, building the intuition for when it's better to try to circumvent that solution entirely rather than patch is a skill you have to hone over the years. I don't have any advice other than try both when it feels right and shift around over time. But the gap between patching versus replacing is a really hard thing to strike the right balance for. And in an era with AI where replacing is easier than ever, I'm scared we're going to overcorrect and become much more replacing, much less patching. But right now, we're much too willing to patch something that's fundamentally broken and not willing enough to replace it when it makes sense to. So I'm okay with this correction. It's been a nice change in the industry to see us more willing to delete things that don't work. Like with T3 chat, you might have seen my video about the crazy journey I went through with the database there. I deleted more code than I shipped there. I've deleted 3 full sync engines and data layers that I built for T3 chat because it was easier to rethink it from the ground up than it was to patch it. At least patch it the number of times we had to. Oh, I like this framing a lot. I like this a lot, overnight send. If you're not adding things back, you've not removed enough. Banger. Love this. So where were we now? This has been a chaotic journey. Let's see if we can get more value out of it. Ooh, state manager. Obviously, style system, Tailwind Chad CN. Watch my video about modern style solutions if you want my thoughts on that. A deeper topic. State management is a complex one. I'm just going to list a bunch of things and hopefully not have to talk too much about them. Just some things that are useful. React query, server, components, Jodi, Zustand, legend, state, Dexy. These may or may not be placed in the order that I recommend trying them. And when the solution you're on stops serving the need that you have, you move down one layer. I would never make a claim that bold, though, because why would I ever pretend to have used every single modern state solution and only recommend 6 of them and then use 4 to 6 of them in parallel at any given time? I'm not saying always use React Query, but I'm kind of saying always use React Query. At the very least, I'm saying that every time I didn't include React Query, I ended up regretting it at some point. So, yeah. I see a good suggestion from chat, which is I start with server components first, React Query second. Usually I do the same, but almost every time I end up having problems that React Query solves better. But yeah, I really like server components and RSC behaviors in the minimal case. I would go as far as to say if you can use server components for the core of your application without doing anything too scary, you almost certainly should. Like when I built my pager app, which you guys ever wondered how we get the new models added to T3 chat immediately? It's because I built an app to page me. And the page me app allows for people who are approved with a custom password and auth to tell me a new model just dropped. And then I get a phone call that alerts me so I know that that happened. The Page Theo app was originally generated. I tried Lovable. It struggled with some of the more nuanced things. I tried V0 and it almost scaffolded it right. I got frustrated and just went and built it myself instead. And by myself, I mean with a lot of help from our friends over at Claude and Cursor. You get the idea though. The fun with this one is that I did everything through server components and it was actually quite nice. I do have a KV because the KV stores all of the models that people have submitted. So I have that little section that shows if a model's been submitted or not. So I don't have 5 people paging me for the same thing. But all of this is server components. There is basically 0 client code on this project. And it's been very nice because I'm basically just using React to build an interface to my KV and an interface to my free tier, Twilio, for the phone call side. So it's actually beautifully simple. And I love it because this doesn't need a bunch of complex client-side behaviors. It needs a basic form with basic submission behaviors and an auth check and a way to list the things that people have submitted. When you use server components in a simple way, they are incredibly simple. The problem is if you use server components for complex things, you'll quickly, probably at least, run into some insane problems. I still like them a lot. I miss server components in all the places I can't use them. I've missed them a lot throughout T3 checks. They're not using them at all. If you can't use them, React Query, really good way to deal with async stuff in React. React sucks at async. React Query makes it suck less. Jodi is the, oh shit, I need this local storage value in 5 places is what I almost always use it for. Zustand is, oh shit, these 5 things relate to each other and I want to organize them all in one place. I use Zustand primarily for stuff like ping, where you have the really complex like interactions between users, device state management, and all the other things for a live video call. Zustand's killer for that use case. Legend State is a phenomenally fascinating project that came kind of out of the React Native world. That is a super granular, really well optimized state solution with good sync primitives built in. Still very early, but I've been playing with it more and more, considering moving some stuff over to in the near future. And then Dexy. Dexy was built to make it so that Internet Explorer 7 could actually use an IndexedDB-like thing, because IndexedDB is a terrible API that is really hard to use. Dexy is currently the core powering most of T3 chat. It has been awesome. Their cloud product scares me and doesn't really solve the problems that we have, but the core Dexy library is probably the best way to deal with and fight all of the chaos that is IndexedDB and browser standards about storing data. It's what we're using for T3 chat. I wouldn't recommend it unless you need it, but if you need it, it's very easy to recommend. If you're storing more than 10 megabytes of data on the client, you probably need Dexy for it. That's where I'm at with state managers. Start simple, add complexity as you need it, and trim constantly or you will slowly go insane. Okay, API system and library. Almost all of the projects I've talked about so far, the big 2 being Picthing and T3 chat, started without TRPC when I built them initially, and ended up with me adding TRPC because I fucked up and deeply regretted not having it. TRPC is still the only sane way to deal with complex back-end, front-end relationships, and the results are incredible. It's so nice to work with. So this is the switch that manages whether or not the database gets updated with your chat history if you do or don't want to sync your chat history. If I go to my use sync enabled hook, you'll see something interesting here. Use query TRPC. Wait, don't you call TRPC.useQuery? What's going on there? What's going on here is there's a new way to call React Query with TRPC, where instead of TRPC wrapping React Query, we take the things that React Query expects, the keys, the options, all the other pieces, and we generate it and pass it to React Query so we can use the same React Query instance for all of the things in our app. And it's really, really nice. I've been super happy with the experience using this new way. It's weird because now we're interfacing between React Query and TRPC back and forth more often, but we get a lot of cool benefits from it too. It's been really nice. The magic of TRPC is the type safety and simplicity of things once it's set up, but the magic of how deeply this type safety is integrated. This component's a client component. I might not have put use client on top, but every component in T3 chat is a client component due to the way we architected it. We'll get to that in a bit. But watch what happens when I command click get preferences. Now I'm in my backend TRPC folder on the exact function that I am calling on the client. How cool is that? It's so nice hopping between the backend and the front end with TypeScript as the binding between the two. No GraphQL schema interpolating bullshit. No crazy open API spec that no one remembers to generate that makes it impossible to figure out what's coming from where and everyone's scared to change. You just go to the backend and make a change and the front end will see the change. It's so nice. And every time I don't do it, I end up regretting it. I went super hard with server actions with the first version of T3 chat, and we have since gutted all of them. I probably should have started with TRPC, but once again, as I always do, I convince myself, oh, I don't need it. This is simple enough. And then as soon as it's not simple enough, I desperately reach for Julius to hop in the code base and set it up for me. Yeah, TRPC still feels borderline necessary for complex enough applications. If you could possibly keep your backend and frontend in the same project, TRPC is going to make your life much easier and allow you to stay in that monolithic solution for a while. It's really nice. I'm really happy with it. And unlike server actions, it's also been relatively stable and doesn't have a bunch of weird edge cases that make no fucking sense at all. I've been to hell and back. I have a lot of stories to tell at some point. Speaking of stories to tell, let's dive into how I have the routing architected here. We're going to skip a few steps here, but the routing we have set up is fascinating. You'll notice that despite being a Next.js code base, we have React Router in here. I really didn't want to do routing on the server side. I did not want using T3 chat to ever block on server ever. I wanted you to be able to navigate and do things in T3 chat without ever having to deal with the network connection blocking you from going from one place to another. So I used React Router in Next.js. How did I do that? A pile of hacks I don't necessarily recommend. I am still in the process of exploring what we've been calling the Nexit for this project to see what moving off Next looks like. And every time we make meaningful progress in it, something stupid happens that requires us to rewrite way too much shit in a way that is less maintainable and more complex. And I sigh and shrug and just stick with Next. I have been very surprised how well this hack has scaled for us, but I am not recommending it. I do have this though. Here, I import Next Dynamic because I can't SSR this component if I do everything breaks. Dynamic is for static because I want this route to be static. And then I export the function app. And app is a much more traditional React Router client-side application. Why is this in static app shell? Why isn't this just a catch-all route? Because in Next.js, catch-all routes are always dynamic because it needs to know the URL, which means that I was running server code every time you navigated to the first page when you opened T3 chat. That was bad and dumb. So I fixed that here by making everything static and making it a static route. Because if I made this a catch-all route, it would no longer be static and this would just error. But how does this handle every page? More hacks. Here's the app shell rewrite. If the source is /path, which means if it's anything, then I redirect it to static app shell. But I also added this missing callout here because the TRPC endpoints also use a catch-all route. And a really fun thing about the way Next works is if you do a rewrite in the config here, that takes precedence over rewrites and catch-all routes in your actual Next router. So this router was having its routes intercepted by my config, and when you would try to call TRPC, it would get back that static HTML page. So I had to add a custom header on all TRPC calls, and then filter out things with that header in my Next config to make sure that they don't get abducted by this catch-all route. I am not interested in sharing how long it took me to get this all working properly. I just hope I can save somebody who's making the same bad decisions as me a little bit of time in the process. Could I use TanStack Router? Could I use Remix? Could I use all of these other things? I'm going to show you guys something fun. Notice this PR here. Notice who made this PR here. Notice that it was done last month and it still hasn't merged. I have been promised by a lot of people smarter than me that this move would be totally doable and easy. Those people are currently making changes to their library, so this is actually somewhat possible. At this point, it's a race between the Remix team and the TanStack team as to who can add the missing pieces first, so I can make a move that doesn't make me rip my hair out. The way that Remix and React Router handles cookies feels like we're in the 90s again. And TanStack, despite being way further along with those things, has enough pieces that don't fit together nicely for our use cases that Tanner is going really hard on single page app behaviors in order to make it way better for us to adopt. They're also in the process of removing Vinxi, which is the core that they've built around for a while. And I do not want to adopt a framework that is about to rip its core out. So one of these might be the move in the future, but as crazy as it might sound that I'm saying this, Next is more stable than the other options right now, even in my weird bastardized way of using it. So yeah, stop asking about other frameworks. I've considered them more deeply than you by people who are smarter than you, people who are smarter than me, and we'll do it eventually. But for now, this is working really well. But once again, the point of this video isn't you should copy my exact stack. It is a set of warnings on the sirens that will call you on the process of trying to build things like this. Yeah, good luck, have fun. So that's the routing situation, and also the fun workarounds that I've learned to deal with since to make this all viable. What else do we have that's valuable in the stack? Okay, we've handled the state management API stuff, handled backend framework, still on Next, will be there indefinitely. I wish I could use Elixir more, but TypeScript is just too useful for too many different things. We covered the database dialect and provider. My hot take there is use a good KV for as long as is reasonable, because any database can be turned into a DB, but not every DB can be turned into a KV. So if you start with the key value store, moving from the key value store to SQL is not particularly hard. And you can do that at almost any point and be fine. That's what I did twice, and it's been totally sustainable for us since I started. And I also really like the experience I've had with Upstash. They've just been great. Really easy way to deal with data at scale for things that need to respond really quick. I've been happy with it. Highly recommend. Use it when you can. Move off it when you can't. Keep it simple. We just covered the router. Next, when server, React router, when client. I used to be a really, really big fan of Wouter, which was a really minimal React router alternative. React router is in a pretty good state now. TanStack router is in a phenomenal state now. I need to use it for more stuff. I just haven't. I haven't had complex enough search params to really benefit from it, and I don't want the data loading patterns unless I have the server-side part with TanStack start. So for me, TanStack router is just waiting for the TanStack start part to fully come together, and I'll probably be all in on it. But for now, this is stuff that I'm using to keep my shit stable. The funniest part with the way we're using React router, I probably should have mentioned this before, this is not the new React router syntax. I'm using the React router syntax from V4. They're on V7. This is the same router syntax I used at Twitch in 2018. The new stuff seems really cool. The file-based routing and stuff is genuinely seemingly pretty awesome. I'll get there when I get there. Not my problem right now. We got shit to do. I am very happy with my routes being components that have a URL and the thing they render. Pretty simple. Makes my life better. I'm happy with this. Everybody's saying I obsessively adopt the newest things, have not read any of my code. I don't. I say right before the auth section, because the two auth providers I find myself using the most are Clerk, almost always, and if not Clerk, Pain. I have a long video about the different auth options and when I do and don't recommend them. I'm also getting more and more WorkOS pelled as I see the benefits for the enterprise side. Like if you want to be able to get an enterprise team to set up your crazy auth stuff in their company through their IT team, the admin panel is just one of those things that I never want to do in my life. Like if a random company that wants to buy T3 chat needs to set up Okta or SAML, I don't want to do any of that. And WorkOS is what we'll almost certainly move to when the time comes for enterprises to start adopting my tools. So Clerk, if you can, if you have specific needs, I personally am pretty happy with OpenAuth. OpenAuth is built by Dax and crew over at SST. It is very hands-on. It does very basic stuff for you and shows you roughly how to pull it all together. It lets you separate your auth into its own service. And I don't want auth in my database ever again. My database is for my data, not for my auth. Keep my auth out. I am very black-pilled now on user table not being in my database, and it's made my life significantly better. OpenAuth lets me do that trivially, where our auth layer for T3 chat is a 20-line of code worker running on Cloudflare, writing KV data straight to Cloudflare's worker KV. And I don't touch it. I don't interface with it. I don't do anything with it. I just call it using the OpenAuth client, and I'm done. It's really nice. It is like roll your own minimal featureless Clerk. And I've been very happy using it for T3 chat, even if it took me forever to set up. And we have random weird edge cases because the examples they gave were missing things that I have to go polyfill after. And validation is a bitch. A bunch of other random things suck about it. But that's welcome to rolling your own auth. It is what it is. But I've been happy with it. It's fine. I did not want an auth solution that expected to run between every single request, because I wanted an auth solution that wouldn't block me for local first stuff. And with T3 chat, I wanted to minimize the things between the user and the stuff they're trying to do. And Clerk makes life much easier by being in your Next.js middleware and running between every single request. I had zero interest in an auth layer that ran between requests. I wanted an auth layer that I could call when I needed to for things that I wanted to check, and that's it. I wanted the simplest possible auth layer that would not block requests until I chose to. And it was flexible enough to get me using it. And I was happy overall. Would I recommend this over Clerk? If you can use Clerk, I would probably recommend just using it. But if you have specific needs, performance characteristics, desires, and other chaotic shit you're trying to do, OpenAuth lets me keep my separation that I really like to keep. I'm quite happy overall. If you want my thoughts on all the other auth libraries that are consistently coming up in chat, if only I had a video where I broke down every single current auth solution and how I feel about it. That'd be really convenient, wouldn't it? Anyways, that's where I'm at with auth. Oh, package manager, finally an easy one. I just use PNPM. Bun will get there someday. I want a solution that just does the one thing though, and PNPM has made my life much better, having everything cached locally and for the most part behaving properly in monorepos. Bun is a runtime. Bun is also a package manager, but their focus is on a lot of other things, bundling, runtimes, lots of other shit. It's missing a ton of stuff for monorepo management, and every time we try to use it in monorepo, we end up in hell and back on PNPM. There's a future where I start using Bun more, but for now, PNPM has made my life significantly easier. I really hope you guys aren't sincerely asking what runtime. My runtime is Node. My runtime will stay Node. My runtime has been Node for a long time, and it will be for a long time. I use Cloudflare for a handful of very specific things that make sense, like an auth wrapper that's on top of a KV, or for PickThing. All of the image optimization is calling different services. Like when I generate the background removed version of this image, that's using a handful of different AI companies, providers, and APIs to remove the background and generate a new asset. I do all of that through Cloudflare because remember, I rebuilt this so many times. I had a really clever solution to the issues I was having with all the state management and keeping track of what had the background removes and whatnot. Look at the URL. It's kind of nonsense, so I'll open up my editor. bg.image.engineering. What's image.engineering? Oh, I guess there's something to see here. Never mind. I'll finish image engineering at some point, but what this project actually is a CDN and image optimization layer that I built on top of Cloudflare because its runtime characteristics were very convenient for the types of scale and weird waiting behaviors that I wanted to have, so that a user could request an image that doesn't exist yet, and I could hold the request hostage until the thing existed. It was a very, very nice way of removing all of the state, and that's probably another one of the themes you should get from my way of building. Whenever I find a way to remove state or remove split brain where data exists in two places, I will go to the ends of the earth to make it happen. I will do really stupid things to make it so data exists in one place instead of two. The less I have to mirror and change and modify and derive data in different places in ways that it can fall out of sync, the happier I am. And every time I have data in two places, I have 4 problems, at least. Every additional place that your data exists is an exponential increase in the surface area for potential problems. And the more I've been able to single source of truth things, the better life has been. And I am far from the only one saying this, and this is far from the only industry that's realizing this. Funny enough, I just hung out with Luke from LTT last night, and he couldn't stop talking about how they're rethinking things internally to have a single source of truth for stuff, because having multiple people, multiple to-do lists and different programs and different calendars and all of that is burning the company down. Single source of truth will make your life better. And the chaos I had for managing which images had their backgrounds removed and which ones didn't was at the point that I was going mad. So the way that image engineering works now, well, more importantly, the way that PickThing works now is when you upload an image, the background removal doesn't start until you render the result. So if I upload an image and then immediately close the tab, the background is never removed. The background is removed when this tag is mounted on the page, and that tag mounted on the page makes the image get fetched from Cloudflare. And if it exists, it gets pulled out of the storage and given to you. And if it doesn't, it gets generated and then given to you while also being written to storage. It allowed for me to reduce so much complexity, and it made this project go from something I was ashamed of to something I'm genuinely really proud of. And that's all on Cloudflare. But that's not part of the PickThing code base. That is a separate image service. And yes, in order to keep things simple and stateless, I find myself making microservices more and more. OpenAuth is effectively a way to make a really simple microservice for your auth layer. And what I just described with image engineering was a simple microservice to remove all the complexity of managing the different states that an image can be in. I'm very happy with the result of those things. But if you're starting with microservices and you're starting with these isolated things, you're going to pick the wrong ones. So start with a monolith, make it as simple as possible. And then the second or third time you're building it, you'll realize, oh, these things could have been their own services. I should probably do that. And you'll be able to make something significantly easier at that point. What else? Anything really good in my package JSON here? Oh, upload thing. Pretty much all of my services use upload thing because pretty much every service has some use case where users can upload stuff. And it is really annoying to set up upload thing. I'm pumped with the service and where it is, but at the same time, I'm just happy that we built a microservice that solves the upload problem, because I had so many projects with a ton of random S3 bullshit that doesn't have to exist anymore. The upload thing code in this code base is some of the simplest stuff in it, and it's so nice not having to worry about those things. Compared to Stripe, where I had to build my own internal microservices to manage who subscribed. Yeah. And Drizzle's my ORM of choice. If I need SQL, I'm usually using Drizzle. Prisma's catching up fast, and I'm considering using it more in the future. But Drizzle's really good. Oh, that's another really important one. Something that's in all of my projects. T3 env. This is a package that Julius made a while back, because managing environment variables when you're hopping between projects and sharing things with others sucks. And if you deploy something and forgot an environment variable, you end up being a liability and a problem for the companies whose services you're using. Half or more of our support tickets for Create T3 app were people who forgot an environment variable when they deployed. T3 env lets you scaffold out all of the environment variables you use in your project and give them Zod validation on build. So now, when you build the project, if environment variables are missing, it will not pass build, and it will error with the specific missing variables. And you can split between client and server. It's super, super nice. It makes our lives way easier as we pass projects around to different developers and different people. It's why someone like Tanner could grab my code base and run it locally, because it was much easier for us to figure out which environment variables he did and didn't need. I'm super happy with T3 env. It's another one of those libraries where when I don't include it, I end up regretting it later on. I recommend it. You should really consider it. Funny enough, T3 env is more popular than Create T3 app now, because it's being used by so many people in so many other stacks and places too. I get so many thanks for building this, and it's amusing to me because I had nothing to do with T3 env. Julius just made it one day and asked if he could use T3 for him. I was like, yeah, sure. Highly recommend it. env.t3.gg if you want to learn more. It's one of the best ways to handle environment variables in your production applications. If you have multiple people working on your project, please try this. And if not, as chat has just pointed out, at least make sure you're manually validating the process CNV, because you will end up in hell if you are not. Multiple people in here saying they're using it and it's going really well for them. That's awesome to see. I think we've covered most of it. My stack's a little chaotic. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. And my stack is more than ever very different between my projects. I'm almost always using TypeScript. I'm usually using React. Hopefully usually using TRPC. I'm often using RSCs. I'm almost always, if I'm using React, I'm using React Query. The reason I'm drawing this way is you can kind of draw a circle, and the circle expands as the needs of what I'm building grow or the problems that I'm having get more painful. But I always try to start with the simplest thing, and most of the time that ends up being TypeScript. And what you'll see is most of the time as my apps get more complex, it's not that I'm swapping one part out for another, it's I'm adding a part, and I'm using less of simple or roll your own things and more correct solutions as the problems I'm running into are more painful. Like the move from KV to SQL wasn't me removing all the KV calls in our project. We still use KV heavily for T3 chat. I don't see a future where our rate limiter isn't on Redis through Upstash, and I don't see a future where our Stripe subscription management isn't also Redis through Upstash. But the data management for your actual things like preferences and your chaotic message history, that all makes a lot of sense to have in a SQL database. Generally speaking, as long as you start with the simplest thing that solves the problem, moving up to more complex things will not be too bad. But moving from a complex thing to a simple thing is no longer a move, it is a rewrite. So if you start with SQL when you should have used a KV, you're rewriting. If you start with a KV and you move to SQL, you're in good hands. If you start with Material UI and you move to Tailwind, you're rewriting. If you start with Tailwind and move to ShadCN, you're adding new components. Start with the simple pieces, and if they don't solve the puzzle you're trying to, add the ones that might actually solve it. I think I've covered everything I want to here. I just fielded questions to see if there was anything I missed here. Most of the questions are about things that I've covered in depth in other videos, so I don't have too much else. The only last thing is the question about servers. Where do I put my servers? Vercel is cool for serverless, but what about servers? I have done an incredible job of avoiding the need for servers for a long time now, and chances are, if I do actually need them, I'm in one of those rare cases where I benefit greatly from having a traditional server. I've already offloaded the work to Julius and Mark, and they're hosting it in AWS, where those severely challenging server loads probably belong. But by the time we're spinning up real servers, we've moved away from these bespoke solutions. and we're back in the chaotic world of managing state and synchronizing it across a bunch of different things and all of the edge cases that come with it. Pretty much every outage we've had with Upload Thing in the past year has been because of servers. So yeah, it is what it is. We're working hard to make it as good as possible, but servers will always kind of suck. All the other questions aren't things I care enough about to talk about. I think this gives you a good look into my brain and how I make technical decisions about the stuff that I build. Keep it simple for as long as you can and add complexity only when necessary. Go out of your way to delete things whenever possible. And if you deleted too much and have to bring things back, that's okay too. I think I've said all I have to here. Let me know what you guys think. Are you going to go copy my stack, or are you going to take the lessons here and go back to Laravel and be happy there? Let me know. Until next time, peace nerds.